Hi, I'm Althea Kaminsky here for the Learning Scientists. And in this month's office hours video, I want to answer a question that was asked by one of our Patreon supporters. So thank you for the question. And they asked if we could speak to this concept of backwards design and course planning. And for those of you who may not be familiar with backwards design, this comes from the book Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and McTighe. I'll put the book in the author's right. I'll put the reference in the notes for this so that you can check out the book if you're interested. And the basic idea is that when most people sit down to design a course, or when lots of people sit down to design a course, you kind of sort of start by brainstorming, what is this class about? What assessments do I want to do? And okay, now at the end, what's kind of what has this all been building towards? What are the learning goals of this? In a backwards design, it's really emphasizing starting with those learning goals, right? So if we thought of that process I just described as maybe forwards design, building a course and building it, starting at the beginning of the course and thinking through how am I going to get to the end. Backwards design then is the reverse. Backwards design is saying, okay, I'm going to start with my learning goals in mind. What is it I want people to get out of this course? Then moving on to assessment. What assessments would I use for that? How would I know that somebody has achieved this learning goal, right? What's a reasonable way to assess that? Or what's a reasonable way to assess that in the context of this course or, right, in a way that is meaningful to what I'm trying to teach. And then based on that, well, what activities, what resources, what materials can I provide or construct or lead people through in order to achieve those goals, right? So this way of approaching course planning, I think, is really complementary to many of the learning strategies that we talk about all the time at the Learning Scientists. Specifically, this seems like a great way to implement spacing and interleaving, things that are kind of challenging to implement because when we tell teachers and students, oh, you should be spacing out your learning, one of the challenges that they run into is like, yeah, but I got to know this stuff tomorrow. like we're kind of thinking about this too late in the process. By starting with the end goal in mind, as an instructor, as an educator building in this framework, you know what it is you're working towards, and you kind of have time and space to play with as you are designing and implementing that course. And it's already kind of just baked into what you're doing. In fact, a few years ago, somebody at my university gave a workshop talking about backwards design, and I just remember feeling really confused because I thought well, yes, of course that's the way that you would design a course. And I realized that it seemed obvious to me, or it was similar to the approach that I was already using, because I had already thought a lot about how I was going to implement spaced retrieval practice and been thinking really carefully about that. And then, upon reflection, I realized the first few times I had to sit down and teach a course and I hadn't had any instruction in it. I just said, well, okay, here's chapter 1 in the book. I guess we're going to go through chapter 1 and I'm going to present all the information. And then we get to chapter 2 and I'm going to, and it kind of all built like that. Now I am much more selective about what it is that I am teaching. I've become much more ruthless with just cutting things out and really focusing on those learning goals and trying to be very conscious and very mindful and purposeful about what activities I'm building into the course, and always thinking, how does this connect back to that learning goal, right? And so it can be, I think, probably an adjustment to switch to this. And it's probably challenging, especially if you're in a situation where you don't have much control over your curriculum and there's really so much you have to do. But I think it really is a valuable approach in terms of course planning. Again, this really forces you to think very carefully about what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? How does this serve the end goal? And when you do that, hopefully you can find that there's some things you can cut. It might reframe something so that you can add in an activity, a spaced practice, something that is really beneficial in the long run for learning. So I would say this is a really great approach to use when planning out teaching, and again lines up really well and reinforces learning strategies. It's interesting because this is sort of, I would say this is kind of like converging evidence or converging ideas on effective teaching practices, that understanding by design and this concept of backwards design aren't explicitly related to spacing, or I mean, when the authors set up and talk about why they do this, they're not citing the same work on spacing per se. It's from a slightly different perspective, but it complements it really well. So it may be using some different terminology, right? I would say this is just how you would design a spaced curriculum, but that's not necessarily the end goal of backwards design, right? Backwards design is not made specifically to implement spacing. And I watched a talk by Wiggins, and he made the really good point that this is just planning, right? That there are so many other things and other skill sets that go into effective teaching, right? That you can have a great plan, you can plan out everything, and then fail in the execution for sure. So it's not that, every problem will be solved and now you're a fantastic teacher now that you've used backward design, but I think it really is a very useful framework, and again lends itself really nicely to using a lot of these effective strategies that we talk about here. So thank you to our Patreon supporters, and thank you for the question. I hope this was helpful. I hope this answered your question, and I hope I've given you the encouragement you need to check it out, to try backwards design, or if you're already using this, I hope that it's working well for you and that you've been able to see some of these links that we've talked about.